As you can tell, we have a little bit of a special treat today. We're going to worship God this morning. Thank you, Elizabeth. Let's give Elizabeth a round of applause, please. As they are going to play for us and honor God and honor the resurrected Christ in song. Let's stand. thank you all for that beautiful music and for putting forth all the effort to learn it, to play it, and what a wonderful way again it is to share with God praise from our hearts. Well, we're here to celebrate the story of Easter today, and I have to tell you a story. There was a United Methodist pastor. His name is Pastor John Strayhorn. True story, by the way. And Pastor Strayhorn had to do a funeral service one day. And he woke up that morning and he wasn't feeling very well. He was feeling quite sick, actually. But still, he went and he did the service. But the place that they were going to lay the person to rest was an hour and a half away. So he's struggling with feeling well enough to do the service. He does it. And the funeral director said, why don't you ride in the hearse with us out there? That way you can kind of rest up a little bit. And then, that way you don't have to drive. So he agreed and he went out there. And the longer it went on, the sicker he got. And by the time he got to the cemetery, it was obvious that he had one heck of a case of the flu. But he made it through. And so when that was completed, the funeral director said, you know what, why don't you, there's nothing in the back, why don't you lay down? This is a true story. And why don't you lay down and just, maybe you'll feel better because we have an hour and a half ride back. So he's sick. He says, okay, and he does it. And he falls asleep. So when he wakes up, the car is stopped. So what does he do? He kind of is waking up and his eyes are a little foggy, and he pulls the curtains on the side of the hearse aside, and he looks out and he's immediately faced with a gas station attendant who's filling up the car. Well, this kid, he looks really. And Pastor Strayhorn later said, he says, you know what, I'm pretty sure that's how the disciples and the people in Jesus' day probably reacted to the resurrection. It was something that was so far beyond belief. There was no explanation for it. I think that they must have, like that gas station attendant, I can kind of picture the funeral director running after him, trying to find it. It's kind of like, what did they do back then? They probably were in such disbelief that the resurrection actually occurred. You guys remember presidential candidate Mike Huckabee? Remember him? He was once asked if he believed in the resurrection. And he said, absolutely. He said, dead people vote in Arkansas all the time. He was trying to be somewhat funny. But there was another woman who took that question very seriously. She was attending a Christmas service at the National Cathedral in Washington, D.C. And there's a picture of the inside. It's a gorgeous facility. If you're ever in D.C. and you have the opportunity to go to the National Cathedral, do it. Okay? It's absolutely astonishing. Anyway, this woman is there with thousands of other people attending this Christmas service. And during the message, the pastor said to the congregation, he said, what is it that you would like for Christmas this year? And this poor woman that was struggling in her faith, she couldn't take it any longer. She stands up and she says, what I really want for Christmas this year is to believe in the resurrection. I want to believe. I want to believe. In many ways, the overall condition of the Christian church worldwide has somewhat of an anemic faith just like that. What would it look like in the Christian church if we honestly, totally, 100% believe in the resurrection of Christ? What would it look like in all of our own daily lives? You see, it's a difficult thing to believe in. That somebody actually rose from the dead after days. After days. We're conditioned in the world to believe that it's impossible. We're conditioned in the world that there's no way. There was, even in Jesus' day, it was an extremely difficult thing to believe in. the disciples themselves and the others, they wrestled with this question. They wrestled with this concept. You know, we read about how Mary Magdalene's response when she first saw the empty tomb was she said, she came running to Simon Peter and the other disciple, the one Jesus loved, and said, "They have taken the Lord out of the tomb, and we don't know where they put him." We don't know where they put him. Again, difficult to believe. Matthew talks about the popular scenario that the body was stolen. And he talks about how the chief priest had paid the guards a large amount of money to say that the body was stolen when they fell asleep at their post. And then he adds in Matthew 28:15, and this story has been widely circulated amongst the Jews to this very day. You see, the point is, anything but the resurrection. Anything other than he really did come back to life. I mean, anything else I can kind of believe, I can go along with. Anybody here ever heard of the Washington Post? Very famous newspaper worldwide. Well, in the Post you can write into various columns and so forth, and one lady writes into one of the columnists there, and she writes, "Dear sirs, our pastor said on Easter that Jesus just swooned on the cross and that the disciples nursed him back to health. What do you think?" Signed, bewildered. Well, there was another person by the name of Charles that was in that forum for this column, and he writes back, and he says, "Dear bewildered, beat your preacher with a cat of 9 tails with 39 strokes, nail him to a cross, hang him in the sun for 6 hours, run a spear through his side, put him in an airless tomb for 36 hours, and see what happens. Sincerely, Charles." You see, it's anything other than the resurrection. Anything we can believe other than the fact that in 3 days, after being in a tomb, after being killed and unmercifully tortured, as Jesus was, that he actually came back to life. Now, how do I say this? That Jesus is here. Jesus has been resurrected. That Jesus is still... How do I say this with conviction? How do I say this? I want to give you some reasons today to believe in the resurrection of Christ. The first one is that those that experienced the resurrection were actually very, very credible witnesses. Let me repeat it. They were extremely credible witnesses. Don't take my word for it. If you haven't read the account of what took place, go back and read it for yourself. And that's exactly what an attorney by the name of Lee Strobel did. Anybody ever heard of Lee Strobel? Yeah, several of them probably read his book. Lee Strobel decided that he was going to look into the story of the resurrection. He was trained at Yale Law School. He worked at the Chicago Tribune as a writer. He was a very detailed, very oriented person toward fact. Had to be fact. But when his wife became a Christian, Lee Strobel was quite intrigued with the changes in her own life, the changes in what she believed and how she acted and what she did. So Lee Strobel said, "I'm going to take some time and I'm going to look into this thing called the resurrection, to see if I can disprove it." That's where he originally headed. But Lee Strobel writes, at the end of a 2-year stint, this is what he writes, and I quote, "He emerged totally convinced and gave his life to Christ." Why? Again, I challenge you to go back and look at the historical records and see if you don't believe it for yourself. It's an extremely chaotic story. Very chaotic. The initial reaction of the disciples themselves is that they didn't believe it. We learn about how Mary Magdalene says they didn't believe it. She didn't believe it. Luke is absolutely blunt. And Luke writes these words. He says, "The disciples did not believe the women because their words seemed to them like nonsense." From Luke chapter 24. You see, even after Christ made himself known to many different witnesses, we read about, remember doubting Thomas? The one that we think, he was doubting Thomas. He was so weak. Actually, what we know about Thomas is he was one of the most sincere disciples that Jesus had close to him. This guy called Doubting Thomas. But we read how Thomas himself, even after he saw the resurrected Christ, would not believe. There's another time that we read in this account of the resurrection of Jesus, and it is the time where Jesus last appeared in the world. And he calls the disciples and he says to them, he says, I want you to meet me on this mountain. Now this is after he died. He spent the 3 days in the tomb. He was resurrected, and he's been appearing now in many different places, to many different people, by the way. And he tells the disciples, he says, I want you to meet me on this mountain. And from Matthew 28, here's what we read. Then the 11 disciples went to Galilee, to the mountain where Jesus told them to go. Okay, so they've followed through. They've gone to the mountain where Jesus said, meet me over there. When they saw him, they worshipped him, but some doubted. I mean, even after, listen to me, even after they've experienced years with this man, they've seen him crucified and die. They've seen him on various occasions resurrected. And now they come to this place where he is glorified and he's going to be ascended. Even after he's ascended into heaven, they still doubt. Now you and I say, I would never doubt. Heck no, I wouldn't be a doubting Thomas. Would you? You see, this isn't a story that's filled with propaganda or anything else. It's not a story that's fabricated. I find it very interesting that in the original context, the original story of the resurrection, they didn't even try to wipe out or change any of the chaotic nature of it, the disbelief and all of those things. They simply recorded what was taking place, what was going on. Even the doubts of their friends, even the accusations of their enemies. You see, the first reason that I believe, and I submit to you to believe in the resurrection, is that the people that recorded it, the people that documented it, were extremely credible witnesses, number one. The second reason I'm going to recommend that you believe totally in the resurrection is that those people were absolutely transformed, completely transformed. See, the disciples, they went from being doubtful, they went from being fearful in their faith and their testimony of Jesus to being extremely dynamic, ferocious, if you will, in their testimony for Christ. They were transformed into something different than who they were on the way in the door, if you will. We read about in the scriptures how this guy called Peter, this guy that denies Jesus 3 times, this guy that says, I'll never give up my testimony of you to my death, and he runs away. This guy that says, call to me and I'll walk on water with you, and he's almost drowns. This guy called Peter, after the resurrection, we read in the scriptures where 7 weeks after, Peter is witnessing to a massive group of people, and we read that 3,000 of those people were converted to the Christian faith that day because of his testimony about the resurrection. Again, I submit to you that Peter became an extremely credible, viable witness for Christ, something that he witnessed along the path. How do you explain such a change in a person's demeanor? How do you explain the change in a person's heart, in a person's testimony, when they are faced with torture, they're faced with persecution, they're even faced with death? How do you account for the person or people, many people that are willing to go to their death for the sake of a story that's not true? Really? Would you? Would you hold on to a lie that bad? There was another true story. There was a Catholic pastor or priest, and as part of a retreat, he got to go to this retreat house, and one of the activities that they had there was they had a teacher of Zen. You ever heard of Zen? So anyway, they had a little one-on-one session, each person that attended, with this Zen teacher. And when this priest went in, he said the Zen teacher was just kind of sitting in the middle of the room with a big smile on his face, kind of rocking back and forth. And they sat there in silence, looking at each other for the longest time, until the Zen teacher finally spoke to this priest. And what he said was, he said, "I like Christianity, but I would not like Christianity without the resurrection." He says, "I want to see the resurrection." You see, what this teacher of Zen was saying was, let me see how this has affected your life. Let me see what your testimony looks like. If you show me how committed you are to this thing that you preach, then I'll believe it too. Because if your life has actually been transformed by what you're preaching and what you're teaching, then I believe that you hold on to that as truth wholeheartedly. You see, that's part of how we realize that the resurrection of Christ was true, is how it changed and it transformed the lives of those people for centuries. The thousands of people that were, it wasn't just the 11 disciples. Don't make that mistake. In Jesus' day, there were many disciples. And there were many other believers and followers who witnessed Jesus resurrected, who also were persecuted and put to death for their testimony that they saw Jesus. There was lots of people. How do you account for the fact that those people were changed? They were transformed to the point to where they couldn't testify against Jesus. They couldn't testify anything different than what they saw. I saw him. I can't deny it. They were transformed to the point to where they couldn't. Even if it meant their own life, they couldn't turn away from what they knew was true. That's one of the reasons I say you have to believe in the resurrection, because of these witnesses that were so credible, and their lives were absolutely converted, changed, transformed. Remember the story about the stoning of Peter? The Apostle Paul stands there holding the cloaks of those people that wanted to stone this disciple. Not Peter, I mean Stephen. Peter is, the disciple Stephen is being stoned for his testimony about Jesus, and the Apostle Paul is holding the cloaks of those people doing it. And Stephen, because he witnessed Jesus before and after, is so convinced. Do you think that Stephen would have held on as the rocks came flying toward him to a lie? Do you think Stephen wouldn't have said, "Oh, no, heck with this. No, it's a lie, leave me alone"? No. He couldn't recant. He couldn't turn away from what he knew and what he saw in his life. Jesus is alive. Jesus, Creator God, the one that knit you and I together, is absolutely alive. And we believe that because of his testimony. You guys have all heard of Larry King, right? You guys have all heard of Columbine, right? Well, Larry King was interviewing one of the young girls that was in the library that day that Columbine took place. Her name was Mickey Kane. And Mickey was having a very difficult time. This was the next day. Larry King was interviewing her. And she's having a hard time staying together. And Larry King, of course, was very patient with her and composed and kind of helped her along. And finally, Mickey says this. She says, "Let me tell you about my friend Cassie." She said, "Cassie was amazing. She completely stood up for God when the killers asked her if there was anyone in the classroom who had faith in Christ. She spoke up and said that she did, and they shot her for it." Now, you don't do this for a lie. You don't do this because it's a thing to do. You see, the resurrection of Christ and our belief in it, our trust and faith in it, it changes who we are. It changed Cassie to the point to where she was willing, in the face of what she was involved with there, to admit, to acknowledge the fact that she had faith in the risen Christ. Not only are the witnesses credible, but their lives were transformed. They were changed. They were changed into people that couldn't deny what Jesus had done. They couldn't deny the fact that Jesus rose from the dead. I did say that there was 3 reasons, though, didn't I? Thirdly, I can't really personally explain, I really can't explain the world that we live in outside of the resurrection. I really can't. You and I have wrestled with this problem probably all of our lives. How can a good God allow such horrible things, such tragedies in life to take place? I mean, how many have you all asked yourself that question? I have. Hundreds of times. You see, in my heart, I really only can give you one explanation, and it's a personal belief. But it's also a belief that's based in Scripture. And that is that God allows us to experience many of the trials and the struggles and the things that we go through in this life so that we will be transformed from spiritual infants into spiritual giants. That's what God is doing. That's what God is allowing. Don't you love it? I love kids. You see, we have to understand that through the tragedies of life, through the disappointments and the horrific things that we go through, they're one of the ways that we internally look at ourselves in the situation and say, we need God. That there must be a God. We grow in our understanding of who God is, and in the resurrection, and in His power and the strength, and what He can do and what He can't. He can do everything, of course. We can't. You see, it is through these struggles in life that we're turned toward God. And we look and we say, God, we need you. It's one of the things the disciples all went through. They struggled in their daily lives, in their witness. They struggled through the disbelief and the disappointment, and they got to the point to where they were willing to die for what they knew as truth. Where would we be if we didn't have this hope of the resurrection as we sit in the lobby or we sit in the waiting room in a hospital? Where would we be as our marriages fall apart, or our kids walk away from us, or we get that phone call at 3 o'clock in the morning? Where would we be without the resurrection of Christ and with our faith in that resurrection? You see, we have to remember that this life, this place, where we are today is not our final destination. I've used the metaphor that it's kind of like a bus stop. We got to choose. Buses are coming along. We got to choose which one to get on. It's kind of like a preparatory school. We go through this life and we learn more and more about who we are and what we think and what we believe and what's important to us and all that. And as we go through struggle after trial after trial, after good time after bad time, after good time after bad, we learn more about who we are becoming. And we are changed by those things. Are you a different person today than you were a year ago? Are you? Is your faith in God different than it was a year ago? That doesn't mean, you know what? None of us have perfect faith. None of us. Let's just get real. We probably have more questions than we have answers. And that's okay. Because so did the disciples. So did the other people in Jesus' day that witnessed the miracles that Jesus did, that witnessed Him on that hill being crucified, that witnessed His return. We all have more questions than we have answers. That's okay. That's okay. There was a young lady, another true story. I got lots of true stories for you today. Another young lady, and her name is Rosemary, and Rosemary worked in an Alzheimer's unit at a nursing home. And Rosemary and one of her colleagues decided that they wanted to play the movie Jesus of Nazareth for the Alzheimer's patients. And they talked back and forth about, is is this really worth it? Is it going to work? They're going to understand what's going on? We don't really know. So they did it anyway. And as they played, they gathered everybody in the room and put the movie on, and they're watching the movie. And it comes to the scene where Mary Magdalene goes to the tomb, and she sees that the tomb is empty, and there's this man there that says, "Why are you looking for the living amongst the dead?" And she goes back to the disciples and she says, "You know, he's alive. I'm telling you, I saw him. He's alive." And in the movie, the doubt in their eyes kind of makes Mary kind of step back a little bit. You know, "Really, Mary? You know, what, you've been drinking today or something?" And from the middle of the room of these patients, this one that was named Esther calls out, "Mary, we believe you. We believe you." You know what, Esther? I believe him too. I believe that Jesus Christ rose from the dead. I believe that the testimony of these extremely credible witnesses is as accurate as it can be. I can go back through historical documents and records, and I can find thousands of examples of people that were tortured and crucified, lost families, they died, all of these things for the sake of the risen Christ. You know what, Esther? I believe it too. But you. That's why we're here today, is to celebrate the fact that Jesus has risen from the dead. And that regardless of what this life throws at us, don't we have a wonderful, great hope? Don't we have something to be excited about? We do. You know, I mentioned earlier the pathetic faith of the Christian church overall. Well, it's because much of that joy that we have for the resurrection, because of the resurrection, has been taken away by the culture. We should never let that happen. Jesus is alive today, alive and well, and walks with us through all of those things, all of the events of life, regardless of how difficult. And as I look around the room, many of you have experienced tremendous difficulty in your life. But guess what? He's there. He's there. Father, I pray that as we continue on this day of celebration, I pray, Lord, that you would open our hearts wide to the realization and the absolute trust and belief that Jesus Christ is alive and well. And Lord, I pray that we would all hold on to that with everything that we have. And that we would praise you and glorify you in our lives. And that just like the disciples and just like the many others, we would be credible witnesses, and that our lives would be transformed, and that others would see that transformation, so that we might let them know that Jesus